Hi there, everybody. My name is Daphne Rabinovich, and I am delighted to welcome you to our fifth book club for 2023. I'll be your host for this evening and for the remaining 9 book clubs. Please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible viewing experience. And it is my profound pleasure to introduce you tonight to our interviewer, Scott Spencer. Scott was one of our jurors last year, and he is the author of 12 novels, including Endless Love, Waking the Dead, A Ship Made of Paper, and Man in the Woods. He has been nominated for the National Book Award 3 times and has taught at Columbia University, the Iowa Writers Workshop, Williams College, the University of Virginia, and at the Eastern Correctional Facility as part of the Bard Prison Initiative. He lives with the writer Joanne Beard in upstate New York. And tonight, Scott will be interviewing the incomparable Noor Naga, author of the 2022 shortlisted and beautifully written novel, If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English. Please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I welcome Noor and Scott.
Mute. Hey, Noor.
Hello.
Hello. So one of the great things about literature, which is a ever-renewing river of inspiration and creativity, is that, I don't know, was it a year ago at this time? I hadn't ever read anything by Noor Naga. And now suddenly she's like one of my favorite writers. And things just keep on moving and changing. And I'm really so happy that we get a little time to spend together and talk about this great book. So for those of you who don't know, Noor Naga is an Alexandrian writer who was born in Philadelphia, raised in Dubai, studied in Toronto, and now lives in Cairo. Her first book was a verse novel called Wash's Praise and was published by McClelland Stewart in 2020, and it won the Pat Lothar Memorial Award as well as the Arab American Book Award. Her debut novel, which is this, an Egyptian Cannot Speak English, won the Grey Wolf Press Africa Prize and the Center for Fiction's First Novel Prize, as well as being shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and the Penn Jean Stein Award, which she should have won. But so let's start talking, because really, you're new to my favorite book list, and I know so little about you, and I'm so fascinated looking at your little thumbnail biography, which is unusual because it's so spread out geographically. Mm-hmm. And it suggests a great deal of moving. You got Philadelphia, Toronto, Cairo, Alexandria. So can you tell me about this, what these places have meant to you and how you got there and how you got out of them? Because I think that writers, like certain kinds of people, are always trying to bore their way as deeply into a place as they can get, use their imagination or their intelligence to figure out things, and then use that same imagination, intelligence to get out of those places. So it's a long question, but I do want to hear about your geographical life.
Sure, yeah. One of the reasons that I put all of my places in my bio is that I really do feel that I'm more sort of geography than history. To give you a sense of who I am, I have to sort of give you a sense of where I've been. Yeah, so I was born in Philadelphia. I have no relationship to Philadelphia. We lived in Charleston, South Carolina until I was 7, and then we moved to Dubai And I was there until I was 18, so for sort of 11 years. But Dubai is a sort of strange place to grow up because of the absence of a naturalization process. So you could be born there and live there your entire life. You could be second generation and never get citizenship. And so the experience of growing up in the Arabian Gulf, and Dubai in particular, especially sort of in the late 90s and early 2000s, means that your relationship to place becomes really sort of tenuous and strange. So this is sort of where the third culture comes in, rather than the sort of classic diasporic model of being kind of caught between two worlds. Growing up in the Gulf means you have a sort of horizontal relationship to place where all place is equally sort of strange and familiar. Because you never really get a sense of belonging there. You're always kind of there contingent on a work permit or on sponsorship from a family member or somebody who's got the work permit. So I think that's really what shaped my my relationship to kind of nation and culture. And so even sort of after leaving and going to Toronto, people used to ask me, don't you have culture shock? Didn't you get culture shock when you arrived in Toronto? And I would say, culture shock from what? In comparison to what? It's not as though I've lived in a place I'm from. So even in Toronto, I felt very immediately like I belonged, like I'd always been there. People treated me as though I was Torontonian off the bat. And now I have a sort of I have a sort of, I think, a deep relationship with the city. But once I finished school, I moved to Cairo, where my family's not actually from, but it's a city that sort of a lot of Egyptians kind of claim because, well, especially being from a sort of smaller city or from the provinces, there aren't a lot of sort of opportunities. So there's so much kind of migration to the capital.
So Alexandria is considered the provinces?
No, but Alexandria is a small city. It's a second city. It's got second city syndrome, and it's sort of and it's a city that people are forever leaving to go to Cairo or to leave the country because there's so little opportunity there, sort of employment wise, but also there's just kind of a general decline. So I don't know, all of these things, I think all of these places are very important for me, and I feel sort of equally a sense of belonging and also alienation from them.
Well, that's so. Your family ended up in Dubai for all those years. Now, how old were you when those Dubai years? What are your ages then?
From 7 to 18.
All right, so that's where the deal gets done, really.
Yeah.
And so you clearly went to an English speaking school, yeah. And what was your family? Your father had worked there.
Yeah, my father's an architect, so
Right.
Dubai is really an architect's dream.
Yeah, really. So what kind of kid were you? I mean, did you have siblings?
Yeah, I'm the first of 5 children. So I've got a brother and 3 sisters, and we're all pretty close.
Well, I'm interested. I mean, because I didn't have grandparents, and I recently became a grandfather. And, so that moment in your in the very beginning of your book, when you're giving your thanks to people, and you give a very particular shout out to your grandmother, who you said you love more than anyone else in the world, basically. So is she still around?
Yeah, she is. Yeah, she's a bit like a mother and father to me, actually. I'm extremely close with her. We're very good friends. She lives in Alexandria, and I try to see her as much as I can. Yeah.
Well, that's amazing. So, are you still writing poetry?
Not so much. No, I think I'm very attracted to narrative. So even when I was writing poetry, I was writing sort of, I wrote a novel in verse. I find it very difficult to write poetry that's sort of detached from character or a narrative arc, a plot. So I think that even the book of poetry, I could have really called fiction. It just would have been harder to sell. And it's not doing something so different from my sort of current novel, If an Egyptian Cannot Speak English. They're both, I think, doing similar things with form, maybe from slightly different ends. So maybe the first book is pushing poetry into fiction, and this one is pushing fiction towards poetry a little bit more, or towards the experimental or the genre bending. But I think of them in sort of similar terms.
So tell me how this book came about. I mean, where were you when you started it?
I was in Cairo, actually, although I wrote this book in across many different cities. But it started with the voice of the boy from Shubrachit.
Mm-hmm.
I find that my projects often start with voices that are sort of disembodied, don't yet have a narrative or a history, and as I kind of follow them, the more I write, the more I sort of discover who this character is, and so I'm generally sort of one step behind the characters, and sort of following them along to figure out who they are, what they want, what they need.
Yeah, that's sort of like Doctorow's description of what it's like to write a novel. He said it's like driving a car in the dark. You can see just as far as the headlights are. Yeah. I amend that saying by saying that the more intense your style, the brighter the headlights. So you can actually see it.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm always surprised by writers who say they sort of plan out their novels in advance and have a roadmap and sort of move chapter by chapter. I find that kind of terrifying, because I generally have no idea where I'm going. And I think for most of the writers I know, that's true. They sort of are figuring it out as they go along. Is that true for you?
Well, I've written, I don't know, 12 novels or something like that. And one of them, the one called Man in the Woods, I didn't know chapter by chapter, but I wrote the end before I wrote anything, because I just knew, I just wanted this end so badly. And so in some ways I was less free in writing it, because I was like saying, well, I'm never going to get to the end if I allow this to happen. Mm. But I got to the end, and it was the book came out exactly the way I wanted it to. Wow. And it was well received, but in some ways it was the most pleasure I've had in writing, the least agony and the least confusion, and it usually takes me 3 or 4 years to write a book. This was probably a year and a half, maybe 2 at the very most, because I knew everything. I knew so much before I began, and it was a great pleasure. But I think it was a once in a lifetime experience, because it never happened before, and it hasn't happened since. And I doubt that I'll have that. Maybe mystery writers have that.
Yeah, well, I think there is something about that, where if you sort of show up to the work every day of sort of writing, sometimes you're given these gifts. Sometimes sort of what people think of as inspiration or something. Sometimes an idea, a concept, or in your case an ending, just comes down fully formed, right. And it's such a fluke and such a kind of freak occurrence. But it's generally not the norm. And
I don't think most literary writers have an outline.
No.
3x5 cards posted up on their little
yeah.
I don't think it works that way. So do you have a routine? Do you what how do you do your work? How do you get it done? I mean, you're teaching, that makes it, I don't teach now, but my partner does, and it makes writing difficult, just to find the time.
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that I've been doing that I've heard from a lot of writers recently that they're also doing that, and so I'm really thinking it's kind of a widespread phenomenon, is pre-pandemic, I used to work with a friend of mine, Andre Babin, who's also a fantastic writer, and we used to get together in cafes and work. And then when the pandemic began, we started meeting on Zoom. And we have a small sort of Zoom group now with a couple other writers, and we get together and we do these timers of sort of 50 minutes where we have a bit of a chat, and then we put on this timer and we all sit and work for 50 minutes, and then we take a break and have a chat, and then we do it again. And I've been hearing from so many writers that this is part of their sort of post-pandemic routine, and I think it's really, I think it's really crucial, because it gives you that sense of community and structure that is the entire reason that sort of MFA programs work, is that they give you a whole bunch of other writers in a room to be working and sharing with. So I sort of would love to see this be a more kind of widespread phenomenon, because it's such good support.
So it doesn't make you feel self-conscious to have people there in the room when you're writing, and I would just
the pressure works. You have to see the little green light on the camera. If you get up to go get a snack, they can see you. It works.
I would have a heart attack. That's so interesting. So do you write in the morning? You write in drafts, and I mean, like I usually do about 5 or 6 drafts of everything before it's, and then I burn the other ones, basically.
Really?
Well, now you don't have to. You can just press delete. But I have no interest in ever seeing them again. They're just
right.
Embarrassing. So how do you do it?
Well, I move more or less. I do a lot of editing as I go. So I do drafts. I mean, I do sort of, once I've got a complete manuscript, I go over it again and again and again and again until I can't find anything to do. Right. But I do sort of write. I do sort of polish really every sentence before I move on to the next one. So I'm not someone who's comfortable or good at doing a lot of kind of free writing and then throwing it out and doing it again. It takes me too long to get the draft out, that I can't sort of toss it aside and start over. It's too precious to me by that point.
I'm trying to make it perfect for the first time. It's not like I'm doing like such a consciousness. It's just I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
It takes me a long time to discover what my novel is about. So did Grey Wolf do your first book?
No, that was McClelland and Stewart.
Oh, that's right. Of course, I've read that. So how did you get to Grey Wolf? How did that work out? I mean, they're quite prominent, and they're not really like a Penguin Random House mainstream, but they're indie mainstream, I guess, is what you would.
Yeah, they're the biggest of the small presses, is how I think of them. Yeah, it was difficult because actually, as I was writing the book, I knew I wanted Grey Wolf. They were my dream house, particularly for this project, because it was so experimental and such a risk, taking so many risks that I was worried my readers wouldn't trust me. And so I knew that I really needed a sort of an avant-garde press that's known for being progressive and experimental and sort of daring, so that the sort of I could sort of use some of their authority to get readers to trust me, because this is a sort of debut work, and so they have no idea who I am. They don't know if I have the authority to be writing what I'm writing, or the authority to be playing as many games as I'm playing. And so I really wanted them, and I just sort of got lucky that they opened up this particular prize for African writers. So that was my in. I didn't have an agent. I still actually don't have an agent. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, maybe my agent's watching tonight. Do you want an agent, or do you just soon not have one? Is that just too stodgy and old world for you, or?
No, I think an agent is necessary. At a certain point. I sort of didn't need one, just because of the way I got the contract. And I'm very sort of, I get very, I'm nervous about the idea of agents, because really, if you don't have the right one, they can actually do a lot of damage, you know, especially kind of if you're sort of early on in your careers. I have friends who've had real sort of horror stories with agents who sign them on, and then they don't actually have enough network to be able to pitch their book. So they burn all these bridges with sort of major presses, and then they can't sell the book. And then the poor writer can't find another agent who'll be willing to take on the same project. So I'm, you know, they're necessary, but I'm always just a bit wary, you know.
Yeah. Well, it was a risky book, but it's not a risky book anymore. I mean, because it really, you know, for a book that, you know, ultimately even questions, you know, what this book is. The book it almost swallows itself whole by the end of the third part. Mm-hmm. And considering, you know, as you said, the games you play, and I don't even want to call it games because it makes it seem frivolous. And I don't think, because I think everything you do is really purposeful. And I think, you know, you're very, very obviously brilliant, but you're also, you know, very, you know, considerate of your characters and considerate of the history that you're portraying and considerate of the reader whose time you're asking for. So it's not, there's nothing gamey about it. You don't feel tricked, but you feel intrigued and kind of, I don't know, purposefully wrong-footed and profitably wrong-footed. You know, I was glad to think, oh, what the hell's going on here? And that was not a stumbling block. That actually enriched the experiences of reading this book a couple of times. But you know, I caught up with the book when it was already launched. But how did that go? Was it a slow burn, or did people get it right away? I mean, I went online because, you know, I'm a very up-to-date old guy, and you know, I could see that the early reviews, like Kirkus and Publishers Weekly, they seemed to get it. I mean, there weren't reviews that I would have written. I mean, because those reviews are written by graduate students who get $50 and they have to do them quickly or they're going to starve to death. So, but I thought, especially the Kirkus, I thought was really enthusiastic and really brave. Brave when I was, you know, it showed a lot of cultural confidence because, you know, when a relatively unknown writer, an experimental book, it's you have a tendency to like hedge your bet. You say, yeah, this is kind of interesting or intriguing, but you know, they said no. In a word, brilliant. And that, you know, I miss that kind of criticism because everyone doesn't want, sort of looking over their own shoulder because I feel there's a lot of cultural cowardice out there, and that's been great. But was it like that all the way through, or was there ups and downs? Because I've only read really, really good reviews of it.
I've been lucky that sort of all of the critical reviews have been really positive. But I do know that people had, I mean, I'm basing my impression off of Goodreads, to be honest, which I don't read anymore, but I read in the beginning just to get a sense of
the Crank Factory.
Yeah, but I find it fascinating because it gives you a sense of kind of the average reader, you know, walking through a bookstore, picks up the book. What do they find? What do they think they're finding? And as you mentioned, you know, it's a risky book, and I wasn't sure with the ending how people would, if people would feel tricked, you know. And there are people who did feel tricked and felt sort of enraged and felt that the ending was a bit of a, and then I woke up and it was all a dream, you know. It had that, you know.
Well, I want to get to that because I want us to be able to talk, but I was actually so happy to see you when we first started that I forgot to ask you to read a couple of pages for us because, you know, I just would love to hear some of these words in your voice, and if you have a section that you read before, you think that we'd like, I would love if you could do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a small section that I can read, that sort of has the one small bit in the voice of the girl and then one small bit in the voice of the guy. And this is sort of early.
How do you pronounce the name of the town, the boy from?
Shobrachit.
I'll never be able to say that.
That's okay. That's okay. You can just say the boy. I'll know which one.
But I did look up that town. It's actually historically a very important place.
Yeah.
I mean, it's where Egyptians and Napoleon's army clashed. It's sort of a part of history that I didn't know anything about. The idea of Napoleon in Egypt, I know that was true, but I never really gave it much thought until I went to the Wikipedia page for that that particular place, and I realized it's incredibly significant.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of even sort of Egyptians wouldn't. That's not what they would immediately think of when they thought of Shobrachit. So I think it's not surprising. It's not at the forefront of our kind of historical awareness.
Did you choose it for a reason?
Not particularly. No. I just sort of I had met someone that was from Shobrachit, and he told me a little bit about it, and so I thought, okay, I'm gonna work with this place.
Great. So let's hear what you got here.
All right. So this the first bit is in the voice of the girl. Question: can you be good together if you don't look good together? It was only when he came home with me that I realized I had never been alone with him before, and that there was something unnatural about doing it now. When we appeared at the entrance of my building, the doorman stopped what he was doing, clipping his toenails, one foot on the hood of a parked car, to look the boy from Shobrachit up and down. I had never seen the doorman behave rudely toward anyone. His face was openly contemptuous. That elevator only takes 2 people at a time, he said loudly, but not to me. There was a sign on the elevator door saying as much. We're 2 people, I countered, as I got in with the boy from Shobrachit and slammed the skeletal metal door, trapping the doorman on the other side with both his feet on the ground. We went up with a shudder, and the next time I came down in the elevator, I came down, thankfully, alone. Question: does furniture recognize, or does it make, a stranger in the house? So this is how she lives. The first night when I went up to see her balconies, I didn't see them. I couldn't see anything but her small face and shiver body. Only when she left the next day for work was I able to examine the place at leisure. Her apartment is in one of the older buildings in downtown Cairo, a corner unit on the 7th floor with high ceilings and classical trimmings on all the balustrades. But the inside is insane, furnished with what she refers to as pieces, gleams handwoven by Fayoumi Bedouins, bookshelves that smell of wintered linseed oil, hardbacks in English and German, which, when opened, reveal ribbons and leaves pressed into their hearts, an enormous steel water filter with a piece of coal inside it, an antique French canapé, orchids that she feeds with an eyedropper and hides in a room I am not allowed to smoke in, a stool with 3 red legs in a slab of unfinished concrete, a gurgling air purifier, a phonograph, a seamstress bust draped in pearls. The tables and chairs are all arranged as though for a portrait at their best angles, with haughty upturned chins and arched foot soles. She leaves the shutters open day and night to display them to the world. The only mess she allows herself is littering the floor with her clothes. The silk dress she wore a week ago is still a puddle in the corner of the bedroom, but otherwise the space is intentional, sensorial. She tells me the apartment was rented furnished from a distant relative, an academic who lives most of the year in Berlin. But even if this is true, enough of it is her own. She belongs to this apartment as much as I don't. It reminds me of the places the foreigners used to stay in 2011, which were always equally perverse. You'd walk in and be confronted immediately with the feeling that all the furniture was living in denial of its geographic circumstance, that the human who had done the arrangements was afraid of the city outside her windows. But in the American girl's apartment, she is perfectly comfortable, and I am the one slinking around the rooms like a thief, unsure where to sit or what to do. She comes and goes to work, and I stay in this apartment that could be anywhere in the world if it weren't for the balconies and me in it.
That's wonderful. I'm sorry, that's just great.
So much.
So, for most of the novel, these characters are nameless. One of them remains nameless. And I actually never even believed, frankly, this may be how I read, I never even believed that the girl's name was Noor, because she didn't seem, she seemed like a fictional character. She seemed too imagined, too nuanced. I mean, because we know fictional characters more than we know real people.
That's true.
A real person is almost impenetrable, but we know David Copperfield more than we know some kid that we see every day. But naming characters or not naming them, it's one of the keys, at least for me, in beginning a book, and sustaining a work of fiction. You have one extreme, you have Dickens, who gives his characters sort of funny or meaningful names, or then on the other hand, you have like Evan Cannell, just Mr. Bridge, Mrs. Bridge, and just as plain as can be. But that's saying something too. And sometimes when we write, you can stick a name on a character. You say, "Oh, I'll come back and fix that later and change that later." But no, you're so almost stuck with it. It becomes like a ghost in the machine that haunts the novel. But you probably do almost nothing by accident when you're writing. I mean, I think you can feel the artistic control that goes into every page, and you chose not to name your main characters. And I wonder if you could just walk me through, that process and what led you to that decision.
It's actually my sort of instinct with all of my work is not to name the characters. I'm not sure why. I feel I feel that I know them better before I name them, and when I give them a name, I become very. It makes me anxious. It makes me feel that I've sort of pinned them down, or that that I'm limited in sort of how I can imagine them. I don't know why, but I sort of feel, if I name a character Sara, then I have to keep thinking, is this really something that a Sara would do? Whereas when I sort of remove the name, then I feel more intimate with them. But the choice to kind of, in the end, the girl sort of is given a name, and and this name had sort of different iterations. I mean, she had a different character name for a long time, and actually the choice to switch it to my own name came at the very end. It was the absolute last edit that I requested to make, actually after the proofs had been sent in, and it was a little too late, and I sort of emailed them and said, you know what, I've been thinking about it and I want to make the switch, which had been it was in the first draft. That was sort of when I first wrote it. I had given her my name as a way of I wanted to sort of, because the book is really about kind of writerly suspicion, and sort of it's about the conceit of writing, and sort of about what happens when you take a narrative from one context, take it overseas, present it to an audience that does not have the context. I was thinking a lot about sort of exploitation, about knowledge production, about about sort of voyeurism. And the book is really about sort of all of those suspicions that whoops, I'm so sorry.
Well,
I'm so sorry. I don't know where it is, but I seem to have lost my phone and it's buzzing somewhere. Anyways, I apologize. I hope whoever it is doesn't phone again. But yeah, so anyways, I wanted to sort of bring a lot of that suspicion onto myself and not feel that I was...
That was so scary, by the way.
Sorry?
That was completely frightening because you said, oops, I'm so sorry. And then you disappeared. I said, what happened?
I'm so sorry.
I didn't hear the buzzing.
Oh.
Sorry.
I apologize. Maybe I should have just left it buzz.
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, well, anyways, so it was a sort of last minute change as a way of, I guess, putting myself in the spotlight a little bit more, or rather sort of under the interrogation light. So that's how that happened.
So the characters feel more like yours. It's like when you name a character, then it's like naming a child. You're putting the child out into the world. I know that some people don't name it. They just call the kid baby for as long as they can until people just pressure them to give the kid a name. I mean, I wasn't at all bothered by the characters not being named because as long as you're not being, as long as I'm not being confused, I'm happy. But, at the end, I did ask myself what that was. How would it have been different if they'd had names? I don't know that it wouldn't have been different for the reader, but maybe just for the writer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's a question in the chat from Baro, who's asking about why the boy doesn't have a name, and I just wanted, because I get this question a lot, I just wanted to kind of give him an answer, and it's that there's something about the sort of namelessness that has a sort of powerlessness to it, and sort of, especially when you've got kind of two main characters and one of them is given a name, is sort of recognized at the level of, at the level of the page by their proper name, and another who isn't. I wanted to I sort of felt that that there was something kind of disempowered about that, and because of the sort of ending that he ends up having, it does feel a bit like a tragedy, and I sort of feel that if he'd had a name, that he wouldn't have died.
That's so interesting. Yeah. Let me remind folks that this is the time, if you have questions, to put it into chat, and we're going to try to get to them if I ever shut up, which is not going to be that easy. So I heard you say once that you consider yourself religious, and that's interesting because I've read in the Western canon, there's a lot of writers who write from a Judeo-Christian point of view, like from Nathaniel Hawthorne, Flannery O'Connor, Bernard Malamud, but to what extent do you think of your work as sort of specifically Muslim in its approach, and to its ethic, and to its meaning?
Well, with my first book, I think faith was at the forefront of the questions that I was exploring. So it's about a woman who's also religious, who has an affair and then has a kind of crisis of faith, and is trying to kind of reconcile her relationship with God after having felt that her approach to worship was very sort of transactional. She felt like, well, I give you this worship and I ask for these things and therefore I deserve these things. And meanwhile, there's her best friend who has a very different relationship to God and is much more kind of grateful, really kind of foregrounds gratitude as a way of relating to the divine. So I think in that book, there's a much more explicit exploration of what it means to kind of live in this faith in a real way, and some of the sort of the challenges of being a moral being in the world, trying to worship in the way that you know how, and coming up against sort of just the difficulty of being a human. But with this book, I think it wasn't important to either of these characters. I was much more kind of interested in questions of power, and insofar as the two characters have a conscience or a sensitivity towards questions of ethics, they are completely outside the sort of realm of faith. So it doesn't really come up in this work, but I think overall the way that my own faith kind of informs everything that I do is that I'm sort of really obsessed with ethical questions, and most of my work can sort of be distilled into one question or a series of questions. So yeah.
Well, the ethical questions that a Flannery O'Connor would ask would be actually very directly answered by her Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know enough about Muslim theology to know if your questions are being answered or if you're just intrigued by them and are following them as an artist.
Right. Well, for this novel, certainly I don't think there is an answer that I can find in my faith. But with my first book, I was sort of really grappling with a lot of different concepts, that are based in scripture about repentance, for example. What does it mean to repent? So there's this really beautiful Quranic verse that's about sort of a group of people who have done wrong, and then the way that their repentance manifests is it says that God returns to them so they can return to him. So it's actually, it begins with the divine sort of approaching, rather than how we think of it, which is that, the human has the agency and they have the responsibility to sort of make that first step. So this is sort of a concept that I was thinking a lot about for that book. So maybe that's sort of more relevant to your question.
Yeah, I think of faith in that very much the same way of just, of finding a way to receive something, not a wish, but just, an understanding. Or anyhow, this is really annoying to me because we have I have so many more questions I'd like to talk to you about, but I want other people to have a chance. So how do we do this? Just click on the Q&A on the bottom here. Do I do that? I'll do that. Here I go. I hope I don't. Okay, well, we talked about Braha's question already. Yeah?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we did, yeah.
So here's an anonymous attendee. Careful here. My question is to Noor about the book cover. Can you talk a bit about selecting this particular painting and what you were aiming for with it? That's interesting. Did you have anything to say about it?
Yes, I picked it. I was very intentional. I said, we need this painting.
All right.
Yeah. So the painter is Jean-Léon Gérôme, who is a sort of really, I probably butchered his name. Please, nobody quote me on that. But he's a very famous Orientalist painter who actually painted the famous cover of Orientalism. The painting that got used on the cover, the snake charmer with the boy holding the snake, who's seen from behind. I really love this painting because it's a painting of a Bishari warrior, and this is a tribe that that existed in Egypt and Sudan. So he is conceivably Egyptian, but also it was commissioned by this woman, I believe, for the Met in New York. And so it has this sort of all these fascinating sort of echoes with the story itself, in that it's, you know, commissioned by this American woman, a New Yorker in particular, of an Egyptian man, a conceivably Egyptian man. He might have been Sudanese, but I mean, the tribe existed in both countries. And it's just sort of so, yeah, so deliciously Orientalist. And when I first kind of showed people the cover, so many people freaked out and they said, they can't do this to you. They can't give you this horribly Orientalist cover. And I said, guys, it's fine. It's ironic. Everything's going to be okay. So I really love it. I think it's perfect.
I think it's very strong, and I think it's very, yeah, I think it's appealing. I never really, I've always asked myself, you know, what covers are for. I mean, I always ask for a print solution. I said, just put the title and my name, but you know, I don't want any competition. But this is, I think it's a beautiful cover, and he does look like a warrior, and he also looks very sort of sexy and delicious. And okay, so let's listen to what Wendy Burton asked you. How do you perfect every sentence before you go on to the next sentence if you don't know where the narrative is going?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think if you trust the sentence, I don't know where the narrative's going, but the sentences sort of do. So you can write a detail that you don't exactly understand yet. You can sort of give yourself a problem to solve, and that actually propels the narrative forward. So I often write sentences that I don't completely understand. It took me a very long time, for example, to realize that the father was mute, and that's why he had this relationship with the son where he couldn't stand up for him against the mother. This is I'm talking about the main character, the boy's father. It took a long time to realize that, but when I sort of examined the sentences I'd already written, it became extremely obvious suddenly. So yeah, so there are all these moments where your intuition will push for particular details, and when you trust it, you kind of figure out the why later and the where later. But yeah,
that's great. So Solution Child's question is something that I wanted to talk about, so I can be happy about not being able to have another hour with you. Lucian Childs asks, can you talk about the last metafictional section? What was your intention in writing it?
Yeah, well, the metafictional section, you know, for me, I was really thinking very deeply as I was writing about kind of my own positionality with regards to both of these characters, but especially with regards to the boy. And it became apparent as I was writing that that this would have to be a book about writing in some way, about the act of writing, and the sort of which voices get heard in which languages, and how do kind of narratives, how do they migrate, and what is the sort of yeah, the sort of mechanism, the publishing industry, how they capitalize and make money off of certain stories, particularly in the moment that we're in, where there's a real kind of excitement around, you know, narratives from marginalized voices and this kind of thing. So I was thinking a lot about that mechanism, and it just kind of gradually became clear to me that the real tragedy at the heart of the book is not the death of the boy, it's what happens to his story after he dies, when he can no longer speak for himself. But even if he'd been alive, he wouldn't have been able to speak for himself to this particular audience. So there's a real for me, a real sort of, yeah, just something so heartbreaking about what happens with his memory, even with people who sort of knew him, who were alive to know him, and yeah, and sort of had the context. So even sort of after he dies, and the kids from Cafe Riche sort of immediately begin to kind of reshape the narrative and present him as some kind of bum that they didn't know, that they hadn't kind of interacted with closely, and that to me was the sort of, yeah, the real tragedy of the book.
Yeah, well, somebody asked me when I just started reading the book, what's it about? And I said, well, I think it's about the failure of the Egyptian revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And, so there seemed to be a strong political tone to the book and a political meaning to the book.
Yeah.
And you have so much going on here. You have what seemed to me a really compelling and believable love story.
Mm-hmm.
And you always run a risk, when you have more than one thing going on in a book, because a reader will attach to one thing and then feel interrupted or frustrated because wait, the book is not staying where I wanted to stay. And you make it a little easier on the reader by leaving that love story in stages. I mean, but the second part is a little bit different from the first part. So you can feel your attachments being loosened, and then you have to reattach, which is so interesting. It's like we're reaching out for those characters to hold on to them as the currents that are racing through the narrative are taking the characters away from us, or taking their predictability away from us, and taking these sort of classic tropes of a love story away from us. And then by the time we get to part 3, we're in a completely different world, and we have to not only question what happened in the book, but what happened to us when we're reading the book. And I was quarreling with that part of the book, to be perfectly honest with you. But it was a fruitful quarrel that actually enriched my appreciation of what you're able to do with the novel. But it was a very, very brave thing to do. I mean, artistically brave. And I'm wondering if anyone tried to talk you out of it.
To be honest, no. Most of the people I spoke to about it were, seemed pretty excited. But yeah, there was a real risk with each of the parts that, as you're saying, it forces the reader to kind of detach, and there's a risk that they won't kind of reconnect, especially because they can sort of feel a bit tricked, or feel a bit disillusioned, or just feel threatened in their reading. And I think the third part in particular, which is so it's enraging, it's meant to be enraging. And so, I often get readers who come to me and they say, but it was so frustrating to read, and why did you do that? And I think, well, because it's frustrating. It's supposed to be frustrating. You had the right reaction. It's not a flaw that you felt frustrated, but I understand also, I understand why they might not have wanted that.
But of course, probably half the people who buy novels have been in MFA workshops, so they can identify with. I mean, the characters in that section were sort of comic. I thought. I thought that their sort of their predictability, their narrow-mindedness was comic. So we have only 3 minutes left. Karen wants to know where did the idea of your book come from?
It starts with voices. for me. I was it starts with the voices, but I was also thinking a lot about sort of North American identity politics and how they translate or don't translate overseas, and sort of how culturally contingent our value systems are, despite seeming so universal. So when you're in a particular context, the way that kind of the narrative around, you know, let's say political correctness, but really in every culture, there's its own version of that. And it can feel just absolutely so solid and universal and timeless, these values. And for me, because I'm somebody who moves around so much, I'm kind of constantly being confronted by actually just how culturally specific they are. And so I really wanted to explore that in narrative form, to have kind of two characters from drastically different backgrounds clashing together and trying to figure out how to be good to each other, even as they're sort of trying to get what they need in the moment and sort of exploiting each other in very sort of subtle and not so subtle ways.
In part two of the book, just quickly trying to find reviews of it. One American reviewer, the boy is described as stalking the American woman. And then in another review, I think it was in a South African publication, which I remember as being actually very well written and smart review, the boy is described as loitering around while hoping to get a look at her, which is so different. You could feel how much more accepting and understanding and nuance is, and you know, but this kid is so easily labeled. He's so easily pigeonholed. He's got the drug problem. He's got the temper problem. He's got the poverty problem. He's got the resentment problem. And I thought he was a wonderful character, and I actually believed in that connection between the two of them. Often you have like so-called lovers in a novel. You wonder, what do they see in each other? But these two are so compelling, so four-dimensional that you're rooting for them. Which is the sort of the agonizing fun of having a love story, is that you want them to be together. You want them to be together, even though almost from the very, very beginning. In fact, from before the beginning that it's impossible. That it's not going to happen. So I'm going to have to wind this up. It's been just absolutely a pleasure speaking with you, and congratulations again on the success of this book, and more important, on the creation of this book. You've given the world something that it needs, and you should be very, very happy with yourself.
Thanks very much, Scott. It's been really a pleasure speaking with you and answering your questions and everybody else's sort of questions that are coming up in the chat. I've really enjoyed it. It's always a pleasure to speak with another writer and be able to have a sort of candid, meandering conversation. So thanks for taking the time.
My pleasure. Hey, Daphne.
Well, and thanks to both of you for making this hour so wonderful and full of engaging thoughts and enlightenment. So thank you so much. I hope everybody enjoyed it just as much as I did. If you know somebody who missed this particular hour, it will be available on our YouTube channel over the next couple of days. And please don't forget to join us in 2 weeks when one of our long-listed authors, André Forget, will be interviewed by Michael Crummy. That will be in 2 weeks tonight. And if you subscribe to our book club mailing list, you will get a notification about that. If not, please feel free to check out all of the book clubs, all of them upcoming, on our website. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful evening.
Good night, everybody.
Thanks, Daphne. Have a good night.